My name is Anna Collins, and before the night my heart stopped. I believed I had everything under control. I've never been a deeply religious person, but I wasn't overly skeptical either. I believed in facts, in evidence, in things that could be measured, explained, and proven. My life was stable, predictable, and organized. I worked as a nurse in a community hospital, someone accustomed to being on the side of those who care, not those who need saving. I spent years at bedside, watching patients struggle between life and death, families crying in the hallway, doctors discussing odds, statistics, and possibilities. I always thought that, because I lived so closely with human frailty, I was somehow prepared for any situation. But the truth is, no one is prepared for when the lifeline is extinguished. That week, I'd been ignoring the signals my body was trying to give me. Extreme fatigue, sudden dizziness, a tightness in my chest that I attributed to the exhaustion of the on-call. Routine. I did what so many people do. I downplayed it, rationalized it, and moved on. Until one morning, in the silence of my own room, my body simply shut down. What happened next was described by doctors as sudden cardiac arrest. 7 minutes in which my heart couldn't pump blood. 7 minutes in which oxygen couldn't reach my brain. 7 minutes that should have meant the end. But, paradoxically, it was the beginning of something that would change my entire understanding of life, consciousness, and what lies beyond. And the most surprising thing is that the first proof that something inexplicable had happened to me didn't come from the sky. It was in the hallway. When the sound of the monitors faded, when the air no longer moved inside me, what remained was a silence so thick it felt like a substance. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was as if the space itself had swallowed every vibration, every fragment of sound. The silence had weight, density, almost as if it could be touched. It was the opposite of the constant noise of the hospital, the opposite of the mingled voices in the hallways. I had always associated silence with peace, but this silence was different. It was absolute. The moment I realized I was inside it, I felt something strange. Time, or what we call time, began to distort. 1 second seemed to stretch like an elastic band about to snap, and at the same time, everything happened at an unfathomable speed. I didn't know if I was trapped in an eternal moment or if I was experiencing hundreds of instants at once. The first physical sensation was as if the weight of my body had dissolved. There was no longer gravity pulling me down, no pressure from the mattress against my back, no stiffness from the hospital sheets. I wasn't trapped by matter. I was in another state, and what astounded me was that, even without a body, I remained conscious. I was still myself. There was no pain. The tightness in my chest, the suffocation, the sudden heart failure that had brought me to that point, all of it vanished. I couldn't feel my lungs, my hands, my heart. And yet, I was awake, more awake than I'd ever been in my life. It was as if, for the first time, my senses functioned without limitations, without the interference of a tired and imperfect body. At first, I thought it was a dream. My trained nurse's mind, accustomed to diagnoses, searched for explanations. Perhaps it was simply an episode of anoxia, a lack of oxygen to the brain, causing vivid hallucinations. I myself had heard doctors explain this to families who had lost someone. The brain, under stress, creates illusions. It's the scientific, rational version. But, given what I was experiencing, this explanation seemed too fragile. Because what I saw and felt had a clarity impossible to describe simply as an illusion. As I reflected, I realized something that would completely change the course of the experience. I could see the room, but from a different perspective. Not through my eyes because they were closed. Not through my body because it lay motionless, inert, on the bed. I saw from above as if suspended a few meters above the bed. I saw the machines. I saw the hustle and bustle of the professionals around me. I saw details I would never have noticed had I been conscious in my physical body. I remember a simple, almost insignificant detail. A blue pen lying on the floor next to one of the paramedics' shoes. The pen was uncapped, rolled near the wheel of the stretcher. And that small, ridiculous details stuck with me like a seal, because I knew that later I would be able to confirm whether it had really happened. But the most striking thing wasn't what I saw of the physical environment. It was what I began to feel as I moved away from it. There was something beyond, something calling. A kind of invisible attraction was pulling me out, away from the hospital space. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It wasn't even curiosity. It was inevitable, as if gravity had shifted direction and was now carrying me to another plane. As I walked away, I noticed a radical change in the light. It wasn't the cold glow of hospital lamps, nor the intermittent glow of monitors. It was an indirect, diffuse light, with no single source. It simply existed everywhere, as if it were the very texture of the space. There was no shadow, and even without shadow, there was no discomfort. This light felt alive. The particles of this light floated in the air like golden dust in a sunbeam, but they weren't dust. They were vibrant fragments, as if each one carried within itself a tiny spark of consciousness. The silence remained absolute, but now I perceived something hidden within it. A rhythm, almost imperceptible, like the sound of breathing that wasn't my own. At that moment, something inside me wanted to resist. I still didn't understand where I was going. Was this death? I asked myself this question in a state of alert, but there was no verbal answer. Instead of words, it was as if space itself was returning sensations. And the feeling was simple: follow. This following had no direction. I wasn't going up or down, forward or backward. It was like crossing an invisible membrane. A membrane between what we know and what we have no language to describe. From a scientific perspective, if someone asked me, I would say that perhaps it was the temporoparietal cortex creating an out-of-body experience. I was familiar with the term. I had read articles about patients who experienced something similar during epileptic seizures. That the intensity, the clarity, the immersion of what I was experiencing. No article, no medical hypothesis could encompass what was happening to me. It wasn't a delirium. It wasn't a dream. It was real. I crossed the membrane. And on the other side, it felt like entering a completely new space, but one that somehow felt familiar. The hospital no longer existed. My body no longer existed. My physical identity no longer held any weight. But my consciousness was more solid than ever. Everything around was filled with this living light, and a silence that was not empty, but full of presence. Time, which had already become distorted, had now vanished completely. There was no past or future, only an absolute, borderless present. In that place, I realized that every thought had weight, every emotion had form. It was as if everything I was being recorded in real time, not in words, not in images, but in vibrations that spread through space. And it was there, suspended between what I knew and what I didn't know, that I realized I had left the body behind. But the question burning inside me was inevitable. What would happen now? Because as much as I felt expanded, as much as I experienced this strange freedom, something told me that I had not yet reached my destination. And it was at this point in the crossing, in this silence full of life and in this light that seemed to breathe, that I began to realize there were rules that were unspoken, but that I simply knew. And the first of these rules was clear. Everything you carry inside you, every thought, every memory, every choice, travels with you. I crossed that invisible membrane without realizing exactly how or when, and suddenly I found myself facing something unlike anything I'd ever known. There was no floor as we know it, no ceiling, no walls, and yet I had a sense of space. It was like being in an infinite vastness and at the same time, feeling that every detail around me had a purpose. The light surrounding me didn't come from a single source, but seemed to spring from all sides, as if the space were woven with it. It wasn't a light that hurt the eyes. It wasn't like the blinding sun or the annoying lamp. This light was soft and penetrating at the same time, filling every part of me, as if piercing my most intimate layers. It was like being seen from the inside out. As I advanced, I realized this vastness wasn't empty. There were paths, not stone or dirt paths, but trails made of pure energy, luminous paths that stretched as far as the eye could see. Each seemed to pulse with its own tone, as if they were rivers of light flowing in different directions. It was then that I understood, without anyone needing to tell me, that this was not just any space. It was a threshold, a place of passage, an in-between world, a corridor that connected what we left behind and what we still don't understand. On one side, there was a bright, golden, welcoming path. The sensation emanating from it was one of expansion, of growth, of something inviting one to move forward without fear. On the other side, there was a deep void, a dark, almost black, indigo blue that seemed to swallow everything that approached. It wasn't exactly evil, but it conveyed a heaviness, a coldness, a sense of dissolution, as if everything that entered it was undone, erased, forgotten. There were no signs indicating where to go. There were no commanding voices or clear instructions. But somehow, I knew, this space showed me choices. Choices that weren't before me for the first time, but that had always been there, hidden deep within everyday life. Now, there they revealed themselves in the form of paths. The silence continued, but it was no longer just silence. Within it, there were echoes. They were subtle vibrations, almost inaudible, but I felt them reverberating within me. These echoes seemed to carry stories of others who had passed through that same space before me, as if the threshold were also an archive, a living record of all the consciousnesses that had ever crossed that border. I stopped. I wanted to observe. What was this space? Why did it seem so familiar? I had no verbal answers, but I could see symbols forming before me. A kind of river that reflected not the landscape, but human choices. Each drop of that river seemed to contain a decision, a thought, an emotion someone had already experienced. I saw banal gestures, a hand holding out a glass of water to someone thirsty next to weighty decisions and abandonment. A hateful word, a wasted opportunity. This river didn't judge. It simply showed. But the simple act of seeing those images made me feel their weight. It was as if each choice had left a real mark on the fabric of existence, a mark that was now impossible to deny. At that moment, I realized that the threshold had its own rules, and these rules didn't need to be explained. They were directly understood, engraved in consciousness. The first was clear. Nothing we do disappears. Everything leaves a trace. I gazed at the path of golden light and felt a call. It vibrated like a living heart, inviting me to follow it. And at the same time, the indigo void exerted a different pull, not of invitation, but of absorption. It was as if it were telling me, if you choose to forget, if you choose to erase, this is the end. Between these two forces, I felt something even more surprising. The threshold didn't push me in any direction. It simply revealed what already existed within me. It was as if to say, there's no pretending here. There's no hiding. Every emotion, every intention, every hidden truth is visible, and that's what determines where you move. I remained still, absorbing the space. My eyes, if I still had eyes, saw subtle symbols forming in the air. A scale made of light. It wasn't physical. It wasn't metal, but a living representation. On one side, small, bright sparks that seemed like memories of love, compassion, and kindness. On the other side, dense shadows, memories of resentment, neglect, and coldness. The scale didn't oscillate because no one controlled it. It simply reflected what each consciousness carried within. At that moment, I realized a second rule. Here, there are no masks. All that you are manifests. You can't hide behind feigned good intentions, nor behind pretty words. Here, there is only the truth of what you've truly nurtured within yourself. I didn't know if I was dreaming, if I was being tricked by my own brain, or if I had, in fact, crossed over into a space that exists beyond death. But one thing was clear. I had never experienced anything so vivid, so detailed, so inescapable. If it were an illusion, Why did it seem more real than life itself? As I peered deeper, I saw echoes of stories that weren't mine, as if the threshold also bore witness to humanity. Fragments of other passages, other moments when people had also stood before this same place. I saw a man from the past holding a diary, its pages illuminated by words describing a similar space. I saw women from distant times writing down their visions in letters, describing rivers, archives, records. It was as if the threshold were a point of convergence, where different generations witnessed the same reality, each trying to describe it with the language of their time. These visions gave me chills, because they meant I wasn't alone, that somehow this experience had been repeated in countless lives, in different cultures, under different beliefs. And yet, nothing told me what would come next. I was faced with paths, symbols, living records, but I didn't know what my destiny would be. The only certainty was this: the threshold was not an end. It was simply the door that revealed who I truly was, and what I would do from then on would change everything. There, before that living space, between the river that held choices and the scale that reflected intentions, a feeling began to grow within me. It didn't come in clear words like an external voice. It wasn't a phrase whispered in my ear. It was something deeper, as if it had sprung from within my own consciousness, and yet wasn't mine. The message was simple, yet immense. What you feed grows, and that is what measures you. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a religious commandment. It was a law, as natural as gravity. I felt it more than I understood it. As a nurse, I'd always understood the human body as a biological machine, governed by chemical and physical laws. But this law I now perceived didn't govern cells, bones, or organs. It governed consciousness itself. In that place, I realized that every emotion we cultivate doesn't disappear. If you harbor resentment, it multiplies and takes root. If you nurture compassion, it blossoms and becomes a force capable of illuminating not only you but everything around you. Nothing is lost. The invisible of everyday life becomes visible in that space. And I could see it. The trails of light stretching across the threshold vibrated in different ways. Some shone brightly, as if fueled by choices of love, kindness, and care. Others were weaker, flickering like dying flames, reflecting choices of indifference, selfishness, and cruelty. And for some reason I couldn't understand, I could sense which of them belonged to me. Images began to form before me, as if space itself was showing me the consequences of my choices. I saw a simple scene. Once, in the hospital, an elderly patient asked for water in the middle of the night. I was tired, overwhelmed, but I brought him the glass anyway, and remained by his side for a few minutes, listening to his stories without interrupting. It was a banal gesture, almost invisible. But there, on the threshold, that gesture shone like a golden spark, growing far beyond anything I could have imagined. Then another scenario unfolded. Once I rejected a coworker who was seeking support. She was crying in the break room, but I was irritated and just walked past her, pretending not to see. I told myself I was too busy, that it wasn't my place at that moment. On the threshold, that choice loomed like a shadow, a small darkness that wouldn't go away. The message was clear. Nothing is too small. Nothing is forgotten. What we nurture in silence becomes our own measure. As I absorbed these revelations, I recalled stories I'd read, records from centuries past in which people described similar experiences. I recall an ancient manuscript from the 19th century in which someone spoke of the weight of choices, as if there were an invisible tribunal within one's own soul. I also recalled passages in the diaries of explorers who, faced with imminent death, described visions of rivers carrying away their actions. At the time, I thought it was the result of hallucinations, fear, and extreme suffering. But now I understand. These accounts weren't metaphors. They were attempts, limited by the language of the time, to accurately convey what I was experiencing. And here I was, in the 21st century, surrounded by monitors and medical technology, living the same reality that others had recorded long before me. I wanted to resist. I wanted to doubt. My rational mind still tried to hold on to the scientific explanation. Maybe it was all just random electrical discharges in my brain. Maybe it was the hippocampus releasing jumbled memories. Maybe it was what's called intrusive REM, when the dream state invades consciousness. But if so, why did the experience seem so coherent? Why was the message so consistent, so clear, so different from a chaotic dream? Silence always gave me the same answer, because it is real. I didn't know exactly who or what was showing me those images. There was no human figure, no face, no voice, but the force of this law, what you feed grows, was imprinted on every particle of that space. It was as if the universe had revealed its most fundamental equation to me. And this equation had a second, even more disturbing aspect. What grows inside you is what will measure you. There were no external courts. There were no invisible judges. There was no one listing my mistakes or virtues. I myself was measured by what I had cultivated throughout my life. It was my own conscience showing me the weight of each choice. This shook me deeply, because I realized how often I had harbored resentments, even small ones, and let them become part of me. How many times I had harbored silent anger, internal criticism, unfair comparisons. All of that was there, before me, in the form of shadows weighing down on me. And at the same time, I realized how many times gestures I considered insignificant had become light. A smile, an act of patience, a word of comfort. Nothing had been in vain. The threshold showed me that life is made of seeds, and every seed you water grows into a tree. Some trees bear nourishing fruit, others grow into thorns that wound, but they all remain recorded. They all count. That was the core message. It didn't matter my religion, my profession, my titles or achievements. What really mattered was what I had nurtured within myself, day after day, through small choices. I felt naked before this revelation, not because I was being judged, but because there was no hiding anything from myself. There, on the threshold, there were no social masks, no excuses, no justifications. There was only the naked truth of my choices. And this truth, while painful, was also liberating, because it meant I could still change. That as long as there was life, as long as there was consciousness, I still had the chance to choose what to feed. This realization was so intense that it felt like it was burned into me. And I knew that if I went back, I would never see life the same way again. But at that moment, I still didn't know if I would return. Was just in the middle of the crossing. And, without understanding how, I knew there would still be proof. Something concrete, something verifiable that would show I had truly left my body. And that was what was coming next. It was in this state, between the bright light and the profound void, that I noticed something unexpected. Until then, everything I had experienced seemed to be happening in a space beyond the body, beyond matter. But suddenly, as if pulled by an invisible force, I was once again aware of the physical environment. Not in the sense of being inside it, because my body remained motionless on the hospital bed, but as if my consciousness had slipped out of the luminous dimension and was once again hovering over the room where my body lay. I saw everything from above, as if my eyes were positioned at an impossible vantage point, observing the scene with crystal clarity. I remember looking down at my body lying there, pale, surrounded by machines and wires. It was strange to see myself as if I were someone else. There was a sense of detachment, of neutrality, as if that form were no longer my home. The paramedics and doctors were in constant motion. I watched their tense expressions, their quick, calculated gestures. One of them was sweating profusely, dripping down his forehead and onto the collar of his lab coat. Another tried to remain calm as he adjusted the cables on his heart monitor. And then I saw something that would become the hallmark of my race. Tiny detail, but one that would later confirm the impossible. In the corner of the room, near the window, there was a high shelf where emergency supplies were normally stored. On it, I saw something unlikely. A pair of surgical scissors, but not the usual model we used in the hospital. They had a worn green handle, with a red ribbon wrapped around the handle, as if someone had improvised them to keep track of them. It caught my attention because it made no sense for them to be there, far from the work area, and because I had never seen scissors like that in our unit. My consciousness hovered over the scene, capturing every detail. I not only saw it, but I could also sense the energy of the people in the room. I sensed the fear disguised as professionalism, the urgency of their movements, and the doubt that hung in the air about whether I would return. At one point I heard something. It wasn't a physical sound, because my ears were disconnected from my body, but I clearly heard a fragment of a sentence spoken by one of the doctors. If she comes back, it will be a miracle. If she comes back, it will be a miracle. That phrase resonated with me like a hallmark, because later I would be able to confirm it. It wasn't just any phrase, uttered in the midst of standard procedure. It was an expression charged with emotion, a confession of uncertainty that a doctor would rarely allow to escape aloud. At that point I knew I was having what's called an out-of-body experience, OBE. I'd read accounts myself, but always with suspicion. Some described seeing hidden objects, others reported hearing conversations in adjacent rooms, and scientists always tried to explain it as a mere projection of the mind, a product of brain activity under stress. But what I was experiencing had a clarity that was impossible to dismiss as fantasy. Floating in that space, I noticed another detail. The blue pen I'd seen earlier, lying on the floor, was still there. Now, from above, I could see that it was leaning against the wheel of the stretcher, exactly as I'd recorded. These small details formed a network of confirmations that would later prove it wasn't an illusion. As I watched, I realized I could move my consciousness with intention. I simply thought of a spot in the room, and I moved there, effortlessly, without physical movement. I tried moving closer to the door, and that's when I noticed something even more astonishing. I could see through it. Outside, in the hallway, two nurses were talking in low voices. I recognized them by sight, but I had never stopped to listen to their conversation. And yet, there I was, catching every word. One of them said, almost whispering, "They're already past their time limit. I don't know if it's worth insisting." The other replied, "Go on, it's protocol." But deep down, it seems pointless. Those words cut through me like blades. I didn't feel anger, but there was an immense sadness in hearing those words while I was still there, conscious, present, silently begging them not to give up. And yet, this detail would also become proof, because later, when I woke up, I would repeat these phrases precisely. Science often suggests that experiences like these can be the result of so-called confabulated memory, when the brain invents details to fill in gaps. But the accuracy of the elements I recorded left no room for error. The blue pen, the scissors with the red tape, the doctor's words, the conversation in the hallway, everything was too specific, beyond my physical reach, impossible to guess. As I watched, I felt again the call of the other space, of the threshold pulling me. It was as if I had been given permission to confirm that, indeed, my consciousness could exist independently of the body. Now that I had proof, it was time to cross over again. The thick silence returned, and with it, the bright light. The hospital began to fade, dissolving like ink in water. The physical scene, the objects, the professionals, everything became secondary to the irresistible force that drew me back to the place between worlds. And so, once again, I left the space of the body and entered the luminous vastness. But now I carried with me something that would change everything. The certainty that it was not imagination. I had seen, I had heard, I had recorded, and every detail could be verified. That was the first test, and it left me with no doubts. But what would come next, in the space of consciousness, would be even deeper. When I returned to the threshold space, I felt something was about to happen. The light around me seemed to vibrate differently, as if it were about to reveal something more intimate, more profound. It wasn't just a place of passage. It was also a place of revelation. And the revelation that came was devastating and at the same time, liberating. Suddenly, images began to appear before me, as if projected into an invisible space. But they weren't ordinary memories, like those we have when trying to remember the past. They were vivid, three-dimensional, charged with emotion. I didn't just see. I felt each moment anew, as if it were happening right there, at that very moment. The first scene seemed banal. I was back at the hospital, years earlier, on an exhausting early morning. An elderly patient had asked me for a glass of water. At that moment, tired and overwhelmed, I considered ignoring him for a few minutes. But something inside me made me get up, pick up the glass and offer it. Not only that, I remained beside him, listening to his old stories, his youthful memories. At the threshold, that small scene expanded like a golden flame, illuminating everything. It was as if that simple gesture had had far greater consequences than I ever realized. I felt that man's gratitude as if it were a living energy, radiating even now. I understood that small acts of kindness create invisible ripples that continue to exist. Then came another scene. This time, I was in the hospital break room. A colleague was crying silently after losing a family member. I saw her, but I walked right past. I was irritated, too busy with my own problems. I didn't offer a hug, didn't ask if she needed anything. At the threshold, this scene appeared like a dense, cold shadow weighing down on me. It wasn't an external accusation. It was the naked truth of what had happened. I felt her pain, as if it were my own, and realized the void my inaction had left. The third scene was even more surprising. Years before, I was in a supermarket, in the checkout line. A mother with 2 young children was struggling to organize her groceries and hold her children at the same time. I remember that, almost without thinking, I helped hold a few things and smiled at the children. It was such a small thing that I never thought about it again. But there, on the threshold, that scene magnified. I felt the mother's sense of relief, the energy of hope that a quick gesture can bring to someone in difficulty. I realized that the impact of our micro-decisions goes far beyond what we imagine. That was it. It wasn't the great achievements that stood out. It wasn't my degree, my long hours of work, my awards or achievements. What truly mattered were the small moments when I chose to nurture compassion, or conversely, omission. Every choice, no matter how small, had left an indelible mark. In this space, I understood that there were no external judgments. There was no judge, pointing out mistakes or successes. I myself felt the weight and lightness of my actions. It was as if life had been recorded in an invisible archive, and was now being returned to me for me to understand. I clearly understood a third rule of threshold. Everything we do, even in silence, has consequences. Nothing disappears. Nothing is forgotten. As the scene slowly faded, I felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. Shame for having wasted so many opportunities to love. Gratitude for realizing that even small acts of kindness had immeasurable value. And in that state of revelation, I knew it wasn't the end yet, because something even greater was about to unfold before me. As the final scene of the life review faded before me, I felt the space around me shift again. The threshold, once vibrant and echoing, began to expand in opposite directions, as if 2 paths were opening at once. I didn't know if I was being tested, guided, or simply invited to choose. But what I saw next remains etched in my memory with an intensity that no scientific explanation can erase. To my left, the room began to fill with a golden light. It wasn't an ordinary gold, like the sun's reflection in a mirror. It was a light that seemed to have substance, as if it could be touched. This light carried a vibration of warmth, of welcome, of absolute peace. I felt that if I took a step in this direction, all heaviness would disappear. There would be no more pain, no more fear, no more doubt. There was only pure, unconditional love. To my right, however, the scene was completely different. A deep, almost infinite space opened up in shades of dark blue and indigo. It wasn't exactly frightening, but it had a density that pulled me down, as if it were an immense void, filled with distant echoes. There was no peace there, but neither was there torment. It was a place of absolute silence, of suspension. I felt that if I continued there, I would be trapped in a state of absence, without pain, but also without light. It was as if it were a choice between fullness and emptiness. I stood at the crossroads of this fork in the road, and I realized I couldn't stay there forever. The threshold demanded a decision, even if I didn't fully understand what it meant to choose one path or the other. And it was at that moment that something happened. Without a physical transmitter, without a voice coming from outside, a phrase echoed within me. It was short, direct, impossible to ignore. "It's not over yet." Phrase didn't come as an order, nor as a plea. It was a fact, a truth that imposed itself within me and resonated so clearly that I felt every particle of my being vibrate. I didn't know where it came from. It wasn't masculine. It wasn't feminine. It wasn't human, nor did it seem divine in the traditional sense. It was neutral and, at the same time, absolute. That sentence changed everything, because, until then, I thought I was in control, that it was up to me to decide whether to follow the golden light or the deep void. But now I understood that the decision wasn't mine alone. There was something bigger, something telling me my time wasn't over, that there were still chapters to be lived, choices to be made, seeds to be planted. I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief because I realized I wasn't being abandoned in that space between worlds. Frustration because a part of me longed for the absolute peace of the golden light, for rest from everything the body carries. But the phrase echoed firm like an anchor. "It's not over yet." As these words reverberated, I saw the two paths begin to dissolve. The golden light receded, the indigo void faded, and the threshold returned to being just the vibrant space that had welcomed me. But now, within me, there was an unshakable certainty. I would have to return. I didn't know what this return would be like, nor what it would mean to live after having seen so much. But I understood that the sentence I had been given would be a riddle to be unraveled for the rest of my life. And the instant this awareness settled on me, I felt an irresistible force pulling me back into my body. The phrase was still echoing in me when I felt the change happen. "It's not over yet." Those words reverberated like waves within my being, and it was in that instant that the force pulled me back. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't kind. It was like being sucked into a vortex, a whirlwind that dragged me from the luminous vastness into a small, cramped, dense box. Suddenly, the absolute silence was shattered by the harsh sound of machines. The beeping of the heart monitors resumed, each electrical signal like thunder in my ears. The weight of my body hit me, as if I'd fallen from a great height. Breathing hurt, each inhale felt like it ripped my lungs apart. My eyelids fluttered, but I couldn't open them immediately. The heat from the hospital spotlights burned my skin. I was back. In that first moment, I didn't know if it was victory or punishment. My body was heavy, slow, filled with pain. The contrast with the lightness of the threshold was so brutal that I cried, not out of sadness, but out of astonishment. I wanted to scream that I had been somewhere else, but my throat was dry, and only a hoarse sound escaped. Shortly after, when I managed to stammer a few words, I noticed the stares around me. Doctors and nurses were looking at each other in shock. One of them, the same one who had said, "If she comes back, it will be a miracle," had tears in his eyes. Later, I confirmed it with him. He looked at me surprised when I repeated exactly what I had said. And then I mentioned the green-handled scissors with the red ribbon. No one understood how I knew. I was firm. "It's on the shelf, by the window." When they checked, they found exactly what I'd described. The room fell silent. The next day, I told them about the conversation I'd overheard in the hallway between the two nurses. They went pale when I confirmed it, word for word. From that moment on, there was no doubt that I had truly been out of my body. But more impactful than the physical evidence were the changes that began to unfold within me. In the following days, I realized I could no longer live as before. Something within me had broken and at the same time rebuilt itself. First, my pace of life. Before, I rushed from shift to shift, believing that the value of my life lay in productivity, results, and blind dedication. Now, every breath seemed precious. I began to slow down, to value silence, to listen more to what my body and mind were asking for. Second, my relationships. My life review had shown me how small gestures have an eternal impact. So I began reconnecting with people I'd forgotten about. A phone call, a hug, a word of support became priorities. I discovered that there's no such thing as wasted time when the intention is genuine. And finally, my purpose. Nursing would never again be just about protocols and diagnoses. Now, I knew every gesture of care could transcend invisible boundaries. Every look, every word, could become a spark of light or just another shadow. This awareness gave me a different, almost sacred responsibility. I came back, but I was never the same, because what I saw and heard on the threshold stays with me to this day, reminding me daily of the phrase I received. It's not over yet, and maybe that's why I'm here, telling you my story. Now tell me, if you were in my place, hearing this sentence, and bringing back this evidence, would you have the courage to change your entire life? I look back and realize I don't have all the answers. I can't say with scientific precision what happened to me, nor can I prove every detail beyond what was confirmed at the hospital. But what has changed in me is undeniable. My way of living, relating, and valuing each moment will never be the same. Some might call it a hallucination. Others might call it a miracle. But what I experienced showed me something no theory can erase. There is something beyond, something that continues. And what we choose to nurture within ourselves, be it love, forgiveness, or resentment, shapes that beyond in profound ways. That's why I keep a phrase with me that echoes every day. Where your attention goes, your eternity grows too. And now, I want to invite you to join this journey. If this story touched you, if it sparked questions, reflections, or even hope, don't let it die here. Leave a like so more people can find this content. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because we'll have other powerful experiences and stories based on real and documented facts that can transform the way we see life and what comes next. And before I close, I have a special request for you. Do you believe that consciousness survives death? If so, write just one word in the comments. Survives. This way, I'll know you're with me on this quest, and together we can create a community that isn't afraid to talk about what really matters. Because in the end, it's not just about surviving. It's about understanding how to live.